this panel hopefully will start to grip with some of the implications of the enormous amount of work Avoid has put forward and the policy, how to use the data and how to use this work in policy decision making. And just a little frame of that, I think as we went through, we were jockeying between different approaches. Some approaches are about optimality, loved by economists, but other people use it. There was some areas of discussion about kind of risk management, and obviously talking about scientific area. Part of my background is in the security field. The security area, you tend to manage the worst case scenario. It's a different way of approaching it. So how do we use this information to inform decision making? What does it mean? And how can it help drive us forward to the right answers? So the first person who's going to grip that and answer most of the questions you've ever had on the issue is Pete Betts. Most of you will know Pete. He's the Director of International Climate Change, but most of us know him in the corridors of climate change negotiations as the very tired person who's there at the end, winning, of course, for the European Union. So Pete, please.
Okay, well, I had prepared a very, very long speech, but I was told just to speak for 5 minutes and say some controversial things. So I'll try to say some controversial, interesting things to get it going a bit. I'm going to say 4 sets of things. I'm going to say, what's the negotiations for, and is our overall strategy right? Where are we going? What are the kind of key policy issues up to 2015? Thirdly, what's the political challenge? Where are we politically in an ambitious deal for 2015? So first one's policy, then politics. And then fourth one, what can you lot do? Okay? So let's just be a bit controversial. So I wasn't here earlier, so I didn't see the presentation, but I think there's a fair number of analyses suggests that we're doing quite a bit as a world. We are not on track. Saying we're not on track does not mean nothing's being done. With a fair wind, if everybody does their pledges, we might be halfway towards a cost-effective trajectory for 2 degrees, or 50% or 67% probability of 2 degrees, David. So I would say that those pledges, which come from every major economy, wouldn't have come without the momentum generated by the international negotiations, and in particular by Copenhagen. Doesn't mean that negotiations is the only thing we should do or that we are doing. So we put far more resources in HMG in trying to shift political conditions. See Neil Morizzetti at the back. He used to be an admiral. He's now the Foreign Secretary's special rep. He goes and talks to the security community and economic communities and others around the world, in the United States, elsewhere, talks about the security implications of climate change and so on. So we do a lot on that. We have £2.9 billion of climate finance. We try and spend that in developing countries to make as much difference as we can to help put countries show countries that they can make this transition without damaging their economic growth. So and we should also explore other things, including, I would suggest, geotechnology, which I know is a great beloved of David. Second thing, what's the policy challenge? I won't say much about this, but it is a very big policy issue to find a deal that everybody in the world can come on board with. So we're going to have to find a way of getting commitments that reflect the diversity of countries, but in a way that doesn't make it a completely impenetrable mass of apples and pears and oranges. We're going to have to find a way of capturing a spectrum of commitments where everybody takes action in a way that reflects their different circumstances. That's one challenge. Another challenge is we know the US the Senate is very, very unlikely, shall we say, to ratify a treaty this side of 2020. I'm not ruling it out, but a comprehensive treaty is probably unlikely. So, we have to look at other options. Do we press ahead and just do what we're going to do anyway, but accept the US does it but doesn't ratify? Or do we change the whole system in a way that the US can come on board? Or do we do something else? Very happy to take questions on that, but there are a spectrum of options that we're looking at. What does the MRV system look like? What's the measurement reporting verification system look like? And the accounting system, so you know a ton is a ton. What does the finance system look like? Who pays and who receives and what's it for? Third thing is the politics. Now, it doesn't take a genius to look around the world today and see that the political conditions are not there for a global deal on the ambition that the science demands. So I think there are some reasons for optimism, as Ed said. So I think Obama mentioned climate change in his inauguration address. Afterwards, he was praised for mentioning climate change. He said, I didn't mention climate change, I talked about climate change. And it came from him personally, not from his team. I think the appointment of Senator Kerry as Secretary of State is a good move. John Kerry has always been a very strong personal proponent of action on climate change. I think those are positive things. I think as Secretary of State alluded to, China, they're doing a lot of good stuff. Maybe a lot of it is for non-climate reasons, but nonetheless it's going in the right direction. They're certainly testing some really innovative and thoughtful policies. EU has been in a difficult place in the last couple of years economically, as we know, but I think there's a reasonable chance that the Germans will start to shift into gear after the election when things settle down a bit in September. I think the fact that France is hosting the COP will give them a very strong stake nationally in a successful outcome. Rumour has it that the Prime Minister, Fabius, will chair. That will mean they will need a big outcome. I think that will help to shift the politics in the EU. Striking that at Davos recently, in January, climate coming back among the elite as one of the three big global issues to tackle. Christine Lagarde at the IMF, Jim Kim at the World Bank really making this a signature issue. And I think this whole theme of risk, and I know Nick has done a lot of really good work on this whole issue of not just of climate risk, but of security risk, of the linkages between climate risk and pressures on scarce resources, ever more expensive resources. All of this is sort of resonating with business and political elites, particularly business elites, and the sort of danger of stranded assets. Big companies and big institutions being into high carbon infrastructure and then finding that they can't get out of it. So fourth thing, how do we ramp up momentum? How do we shift the politics? Well, we're doing quite a lot of work on that. I'm running out of time, I suspect. But what can you do? I am very struck by the way that the debate on the science has shifted in a wrong direction in the last few years, with a growing public perception that the science is like 50-50, is it happening or not? Now, I know this represents huge challenges for the scientific community because you rightly pride yourself on evidence. You are uncomfortable with advocacy, and I understand that completely. I'm not contesting that. But I think that sometimes the language you use and the nuance you use is simply not grasped by lay people. And when you say there's a strong possibility, they hear, oh, well, it's 50-50, whereas you mean it's 95 or 99% or something. And I don't know what the solution is, but finding some way around that. I think the point that was made before before the break about impacts and communicating the impacts in a way that resonate and that people understand and with more granularity. And I know David and the team and the Avoid team have been doing a lot of really good work on that. But the more we can do thinking about the impacts in a way that will resonate, because people just don't get. It's very hard to communicate 20, 30 years ahead that something is going to hit them, and finding a way of communicating that with immediacy and scientific rigor is important. And then another issue which I know Nick has been thinking about is, and helped me to think through is, if we could understand more, and I know this is difficult, the trigger points. When might these catastrophic trigger points come in? I know this is difficult, but if we had a better understanding of, what kind of temperature levels, is it 2 or is it 2.5, or, to really understand more so that, we could communicate the risks in a way that could be immediate. So I've probably gone over my time a bit, but there you go. That's it.
Thanks very much, Pete. The next speaker is Jim Ski, who I now see, as well as being on the Committee of Climate Change, is at Imperial College, which is so lucky I've had a biography because I'd have given you an old affiliation. Jim.
Yeah, okay. I think the most overused word in the climate change debate in the UK domestically is probably the word challenging. And there is no doubt that the 80% reduction target for 2050 is challenging. And to achieve it, we need to do broadly 3 things. One is decarbonise electricity. Second is the aggressive pursuit of energy efficiency. And the third one is electrification, moving to alternative fuels. I think the good thing on the policy side is that the government does have flagship policy initiatives in 2 of these areas. Ed Davey mentioned electricity market reform and the energy bill, which the Climate Change Committee is hugely enthusiastic about. It's broadly the right approach for encouraging capital-intensive, low-carbon generation. I promised David Warlow when he invited me, but I wouldn't carp, but I will just say one thing, that of course, The Committee on Climate Change disagrees with HMG about the need for a carbon intensity target in the energy bill currently going through Parliament. We need it, we think we need it for certainty, not only for getting low carbon electricity going, but to attract the industry that will build it to the UK as well. But broadly, we're there. The other thing is we absolutely need to press ahead with CCS demonstration. It's a complete game changer in terms of future scenarios, and the world would look very different depending on whether or not you have it. Second big flagship is the Green Deal on the energy efficiency side. And if I choose my words very carefully, I should say we are probably cautious about the transformational impacts of the financial deal that's on offer. But nevertheless, I think there's a lot of good stuff in the Green Deal that's about building the infrastructure around an energy efficiency industry. Training, accreditation, the number and range of Green Deal providers that emerged is actually quite impressive, and building on that legacy, I think, is going to be the important thing going forward. Probably the weakest area of the three is the question around electrification and the heat sector, where there are a lot more scattered policies around the system. It's not clear about consumer take-up of novel technologies like electric vehicles and heat pumps. That really needs to be demonstrated. There's a lot happening on the supply side. You know, we now have maybe 15 different electric vehicles potentially on the market, either now or in the next few years. But only 1,100 were sold in 2011, and a really big scaling up is needed if you're going to move in that direction. On one point that the committee is quite keen to do in its report is actually to celebrate success points as well. So I do want to be positive about a few things. New conventional cars, the carbon intensity is going down much faster than the indicator trajectory that the committee set. It was down to 138 grams a kilometre in 2011, which was well ahead of where we needed to be. We also report to the devolved administrations, and for example, in the last report on Scotland, we were celebrating the progress with renewable energy and strong progress on energy efficiency there, particularly in relation to social housing. And the Welsh Assembly Government is making excellent progress in the residential and waste sectors. Wales now recycles more than half of its waste, which is a pretty impressive record. Now, more on the sort of research side, there are two sort of issues that I wanted to flag as things that might need wider consideration going forward. And given my current role as Research Council's Energy Strategy Fellow, I do, of course, have to mention technology in there as one of the issues. Now, if I have a problem with some of the analytical systems modelling that's underpinned the UK framework at the moment, it's the assumption that we can divide the different sectors of the economy into two bits, which I will loosely call the easy bits and the hard bits. And the hard bits are things like aviation, industry, agriculture. And largely in the difficult sectors, what we've done is made modest assumptions about what can be achieved, netted that out of the targets, and then just cranked the models harder and harder until the easy sectors deliver what you need to. I don't think that binary divide between hard sectors where you do what you can and easy sectors where you do what you must is the right one. There are potentially other technological solutions out to 2050 that could come into play, and I think a more spectrum approach to the technologies would be really helpful. The very obvious thing, the 80% greenhouse gas target converts into 85% for CO2 and 90% for CO2 from inland energy consumption. That is truly demanding stuff, even if you think the sectors are easy, in inverted commas. The other research area I just wanted to flag is the wider sustainability impacts of what your actions taken in the UK. And really two parts to do it. At the invitation of the government, the Climate Change Committee is currently looking at consumption-based emissions, carbon leakage, and competitiveness issues. And I think that's an issue that absolutely needs to be addressed. Some of the technologies that we might deploy have impacts beyond our borders. Some of our policies will lead to carbon leakage, and I think this is a subject that does need attention. The last issue under the sustainability side is looking at the wider sustainability impacts of low carbon pathways. It is interesting that the Scottish Climate Change Act has environment and biodiversity as one of the criteria that needs to be taken into account, but the UK Climate Change Act does not. Now, so there's a very interesting issue there about the implications of different low-carbon pathways, the wider sustainability impacts. That's not to say that you say you don't do the carbonisation, but do it in clever ways that take account of a wider range of issues. For me, I think that's really quite an important part of it. I'll just say one thing to finish, and it's really to echo what Ed Davies said. I think the Climate Change Act framework is really quite unique internationally. There's a lot of interest in it overseas, judging by the number of foreign PhD students that want to interview about how the Climate Change Committee works, etc. I think it was intended to solve the problem of keeping long-term policy coherence in a consistent way to get over short-term political cycles. And I think that is something that is worthwhile clinging on to, and I hope that plays into it when we go into this 2014 review of the fourth carbon budget.
Thanks a lot, Jim. And I think there's two things. If Pete talked about what might be possible politically, I think it's very interesting with us reflecting the conversation about people's feelings about what might be possible technically and in terms of driving down those emissions post the peak, which seems to be the place where you decide you really need to get the pace, and whether that is an equal percentage year or perhaps something a bit more ambitious, and what we should think, how we should think about that part of the equation. Our final panelist is Professor Julius Singer, who people know as the Chief Scientist at the Met Office, who I will, in a shorter way, ask the question I tried to ask earlier. How much risk would you take?
Right, thank you very much. I'm going to take us back to the dangerous climate change question, really, because I think we've had a lot of focus on the meeting, and rightly so, about the energy technologies to take us to a low-carbon futures and so forth, because we all accept that we need to limit climate change. But I think, what do we really mean by dangerous climate change? For whom, when and where is where I come at it from. And these are important questions because they take then into take in the issues that Sir John raised, which is about exposure, where we choose to live. We live much more in cities, we live on coasts, we are likely to be much more exposed going forward, and also how vulnerable societies are, so how we choose to live, the dependencies we have on natural resources, on food and water, and of course energy. And that, I think, takes us away from these very simple concepts of global mean temperature and the idea that somehow, if you know the global mean temperature, you kind of know what the regional patterns of climate change are. Because it takes us towards water. And I think there's an urgent need to move away from global mean temperature to thinking about changes in water availability, changes in rainfall patterns, changes in our weather patterns, and to go from these global ideas to regional and local concepts. And I would, Brian Hoskins challenged us in the break to say, did we really, as climate scientists and meteorologists, really believe that 4 degrees C globally warmed world would be twice as bad as a 2 degrees C globally warmed world? And actually, even from basic physics, you know that that's not going to be the case. There are huge nonlinearities in the system. And we need to start thinking what those are, not just for the global things, but at the regional, local level, which is where dangerous climate change will manifest itself. The second thing to say about this is that, of course, dangerous climate change will be felt, I would argue, through changes in hazardous weather and climate extremes, not just in the inexorable rise in mean temperatures globally. And if we ever wanted evidence for that, look at the last year, which has really pushed some systems pretty much to the limit. Not just climate systems, but actually the whole economic, social infrastructure. And then the third thing, of course, is that if you accept that, then there has to be a much greater focus on the weather and climate volatility that represents dangerous climate change. So we need to move away from this idea of 30-year mean averages and talk about, within those periods that we are trying to make assessments of whether climate change is dangerous or not, what will the weather volatility look like? What will the climate volatility look like? Will we have more of the US heat waves that we saw last year? Will we in the UK have more of this terrible wet weather that's absolutely hit our agricultural systems, and so on and so forth? And of course, you know, it does take us to a much greater focus, therefore, on being able to capture the weather systems that make up our climate and the rain-bearing systems that determine the water cycle, whether the mean rainfall is the same, as Sir John said, for last year. It was, but actually it came in a completely seasonally unfriendly way, and there's emerging evidence that we, on the daily timescale, we're getting more intense rainfall, which has huge implications for flooding and all sorts of impacts like that that are not factored into our current assessments. And I know lots of you will know what I'm going to say next. That drives us to much greater granularity and much greater physical veracity, in a sense, truthfulness about how the climate system works. And therefore you can't escape the need for much higher resolution global models. We have to get our global climate models down to what I call weather resolving scales. That's an absolute necessity, because we need to be able to say how much a 4 degrees C world will be non-linearly very, very much worse than a 2 degrees C world. And at the moment, our climate models can't tell us that, because the resolution is far too coarse for capturing some of the major things that will give us those non-linearities. And I think we need to think about how do we really go from the global weather resolving scale down to the regional and local detail that actually represent the impacts of dangerous climate change to local populations and local infrastructure and so on. And that's a huge challenge for us as a science community. And it needs, of course, investment in the science, it needs investment in the supercomputing, it needs also investment in breaking down the barriers between climate and weather science, which is my business, and the multidisciplinary nature of environment and earth science, system science, which is actually the way in which many of these changes in weather and climate volatility will be manifested through other parts of the geophysical system and through the socio-economic systems. And so there is a real need to, for us to develop a much more integrated environmental system science approach to this problem. And the final thing I wanted to say was about communication. And it's already been noted that we seem to be losing the communication battle. And I think it's because we still talk about global mean temperature changes at 2 or 4 degrees C. I think we have to personalise the message. And personalising the message means going down to that regional, local level, and it means often telling narratives about what we've already seen and what that might mean for the future. And again, some of that we can do by emphasising what will happen in the next 10, 20, 30 years from what we've already emitted, and therefore why it's so important to avoid adding further carbon to the atmosphere if we possibly can. So that's, I think, what I wanted to say on that. We can cover some more in the questions.
Thank you. I think we'll try and squeeze in 10 minutes of questions.
AJ Gambier from Imperial College. It's a question for Pete. Thinking about the lessons that might have been learned from the Bali roadmap and the lead up to Copenhagen, at what point do you think it would be good to start seeing a structure for commitments from the different parties in an eventual global deal? I mean, is there a certain time point where we have to start agreeing the principles about what targets different parties would take?
Other questions?
I'm Rachel James from University of Oxford. I think that in 2015 the 2-degree target is due to be discussed again as to whether it might be revised to 1.5, and that's kind of formally written into the documents from Cancun. But do you think that's going to be an issue, and is it really going to be something that we should be discussing, or should we just move on?
So I wanted to pick up on the communications aspect, which has come up a couple of times. And Pete, you started off by saying that setting out a challenge of communicating impacts in a way that resonates. And Julia picked up on some of that, and particularly focusing on the need to focus in on local impacts and therefore making it more relevant to people. I guess there's still, the science can go so far in providing the information, and then the resonates bit that you were talking about is a sort of extra stage. So I wondered whether or not, Pete in particular, you might want to flesh out a bit more how you saw a strategy, and indeed who should be responsible for doing that extra bit on top of the science in terms of working out how to communicate a message in a way that resonates.
Pete, I think.
Well, I think those questions are all for Jim, weren't they? Well, I'll offer some thoughts, and others may have thoughts as well. So, on the first question about lessons from Copenhagen, I guess, AJ, it depends a little bit what you think the lessons of Copenhagen were. I suppose, as one of the ones who was at Copenhagen, I suppose in policy terms, I would argue it wasn't that bad. You know, in terms of what we thought we'd get before the meeting and what we got, it wasn't that far away. But in political terms, it was disaster, because everybody thought it was a disaster. You know, political and business elites came away thinking this meeting was a disaster, and nothing's, you know, and that impacted on political will to do more, impacted on decisions in investment committees in big companies and so on. So I think that we are going to have to ramp up momentum towards Copenhagen.
You're not repeating Copenhagen,
towards Paris, because big decision makers need a moment. You know, people with busy, prime ministers, and they only focus when you say you've got to be in that chair and you've got to say something or you've got to take a decision. So you need a moment, but you've got to do it in a way that it's not a make or break moment. That if we get a 70% or 80% outcome, which is of what we want, really a good outcome, that it isn't perceived as a disaster because it wasn't everything. So that's actually the lesson, and I think we're going to have to involve leaders in the right kind of way. Probably not in the final deal as we did in Copenhagen, but and we're talking. Nick has done a lot of really good work. E3G has done some excellent work on this. Thinking about how we can begin to involve leaders in the run-up. In terms of what commitments look like, I think that will be a iterative process, and I'm not sure that's really the crunch political issue that we have to. There's a lot of issues underlying that around the legal form and the shape and how varied we're allowed them to be and what the accounting regime is, but I'm not sure that's the crunch issue. So I've forgotten your first name. On Rachel's question about 1.5 degrees, well, this of course has been pushed very hard by some groups in the negotiations, small islands, the LDCs and others, which are groups with whom the EU has worked very closely and has sought to build pressure for ambitious outcomes. I mean, it's no secret that I think our view would be that it's 2 degrees is challenging enough. So 1.5 degrees is breathtakingly challenging, shall we say? So I think we can expect pressure to come from that quarter, and we'll have to deal with it as part of the negotiation process. I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name as well. Emily's question. Well, let me say at the outset, I am not for a second questioning that we should be absolutely rigorous and be always rooted in the science and the evidence. And I hope I didn't give any impression of thinking otherwise, because there will be people out. First of all, it's important because we want to do everything based on science, and secondly, because the slightest slip will be picked up and played in a very not always in a straightforward way by some others with agendas, whose agendas may be much less fair-minded than ours. So I think we should be absolutely grounded in the science, but we do need to find ways to communicate complex scientific messages in a way that ordinary people understand. And I really liked what Julia said. I thought it was really interesting, powerful stuff, and I'd love to learn more about that. I do think that in the end, bureaucrats and politicians are not very convincing talking about the science. Who believes a bureaucrat? Who believes a scientist? You need a scientist to talk about science. And, I see some, there is a perception out there that because there are one or two scientists or quasi-scientists or specialists in climate science who are expressing views about which are very far from the mainstream, but who are given credence. So I think it needs to come. I think there need to be champions from within the scientific community. Is my feeling.
Jim and then Julia, just to wrap up.
Yeah. Could I just comment on the communications thing, since I didn't cover it in my introduction? I think we're beating ourselves up too much about this, actually, because the hard social science evidence is that people do still believe in climate change and are supportive of alternative forms of energy. There's very good work being carried out by Nick Pidgeon at Cardiff within the UK Energy Research Centre that's providing very solid evidence that, as a whole, the public are still behind this agenda. There's a very noisy vocal minority, obviously what we might call the Tea Party tendency in the UK, that is going in the other direction. But it's interesting when you monitor the kind of the to and fro of that. A year or two ago, it leaked out of the blogosphere into the mainstream media. It's not doing it to the same extent, I think, at the moment. It's gone a little bit back in the box, though I can see Pete disagrees.
I'm not sure about the social science evidence. I think there's some evidence from polling that belief in climate change has declined in Britain in the last few years, not to speak of the US and elsewhere.
Yeah, though it tends to be isolated among males of a certain age and class. I think it probably has to be said. Can make one other issue on communications. The new chair of the Climate Change Committee, Lord Deben, is incredibly interested in an argument that hasn't been put here, which is the insurance one, which, knowing what we don't know about climate change in the future, it makes a great deal of sense to take a precautionary approach and put in policies that make sense now.
Julia.
I haven't really got a lot to add, so if there are other questions.
Well, I think we're drawing to a close, so your parting shot, I think.
Yes. I think it is incredibly hard for us as scientists somehow, at some times, to get across what is a very complex topic. And of course, some of us who are quite close to government find it also very difficult. And I'm kind of sort of with you, Jim, that actually what I've sensed is an increasing level of desperation by the sceptics, that they are now resorting, rather than attacking the science, they're attacking the economics, or they're attacking individuals, trying to discredit people like myself and other leading scientists in this field by picking away at how we do things, trying to FOI us to death and all that sort of thing, which to me says there's a level of desperation getting in there. But it is really, really important that we keep the integrity of the science absolutely to the fore. And everything we say, we need to think when we say it, do I have the evidence to justify that statement from the literature, and can I present the scientific evidence? Because this is still a very emotive topic. And for those of you who followed the recent debacle with our decadal forecast will understand how that can be presented in very, very misleading ways by quite experienced journalists.
And by the former cabinet secretary in the FT,
yes.
and who replied to him, not a scientist, but somebody from the city.
Yes.
He was. I didn't see a scientist writing back.
It has been written back. But the point is that actually we need to take every opportunity to educate our politicians, our business folk, everybody about the basic underpinning science. And I spent this morning talking to some MPs in the Environment Audit Committee about the decadal problem and what are the real challenges about knowing where the climate system is going for the next few years. How do the oceans work, and how do they play into the whole business of this interface between natural climate variability and climate change? And it takes me back always to this weather climate volatility, hazardous weather climate extremes. We've got to be much stronger about that. We've got to be doing the attribution much more rigorously, which means having the right sort of models. It means having a very good observational base. And I don't think we can back away. We can't get into the position where we kind of just say, well, the science is done. We've got all we need to move ahead, because actually I think the science is a long way from done. And we've got some not only big issues around energy policy, but we have some really big issues about adaptation and adaptive mitigation as well. So a lot more for all of us to do going forward, I think.
Thank you very much. I think a few issues I just want to comment. Firstly, don't worry so much. We just surveyed 20 countries, and it's really the Anglosphere, Australia, UK and US stand out as a place with a climate skeptic media, and there are some very highly placed climate skeptics in the media in this country who, let's say, may be having a slightly warmer time over the next few years than they expected, because they are a force in a way that other countries don't have, just don't have that debate. So don't think your global views can be skewed by being in this media space. It's not the same everywhere. More insidious than the skeptics or deniers, I think, is the Exxon narrative. We're rubbish at mitigation. Let's just face it, we're really good at adaptation. Let's get ready for 4 degrees. And I think it really puts in this idea of explaining what we don't know and how we deal with that is really important.
Yes.
And that leads to me, the communications point has come up very strongly today. Yes, let's get more information. Let's get different people saying it. People who are actually spending money, adapting and building resilience in industries and cities, and showing that real money is being spent now because of the uncertainty. And I don't think we've got those voices out. Again, we surveyed across countries. That a lot of money is being spent, but those people are not in the political debate. Whether they're city managers or large infrastructure owners, they're talking behind the scenes, but they're not influencing debate. So this is real, and we're investing money to manage this risk. But I thought I'd finish on something which I think actually slightly disturbed me about this discussion, which is about the idea that you will only work on science, Pete. Because I worked across a large range of policies in government, and I can tell you that most of our security policy is not based on science, and it invests a lot of public money. We managed to have a societal discussion about the risks of terrorism versus civil liberties in the pub, which is complex and multifaceted. Most people know nothing about jihadism and know nothing about global terrorist networks, but we managed to have a discussion. But we keep on saying climate science is so hard and difficult. We need to have a discussion which can deal with that. And we need to realise that the models will never be perfect, and the job of people like you, Pete, and other people in this room from government is to tell ministers what we know, but also what we think we don't know, where the biases are in our models, where some of the things we haven't clarified at tipping points are, and taking those together, what the judgment is on how we should manage this risk. Because that's what we do on every other existential risk that we deal with in this country, like pandemics, like terrorism, like nuclear deterrence. You might not like the answer, that's why we have democracy. But I think it is very dangerous if we expect the scientists' models to solve those questions for us. For me, it's the job of the decision support, the policy advisor, to bridge the gap between what science can know in the scientific method and what ministers' judgments need to be, because it can't be them doing it all on their own. So perhaps that gap between those 2 points, we have to be better at doing that, because I think that we can't abdicate that to the scientists. We all have to take responsibility. That's my bit anyway. Thank you. David, you're closing.
I hope you found this afternoon's meeting both informative but interesting and useful. What we've covered is actually a very wide range of science. What it demonstrates to me is that dealing with climate change covers a multitude of disciplines, a whole lot of really difficult science, and even when you've stopped doing the science, transferring it into the policy arena is a big challenge in itself. And I think, we won't have answered all the questions here today, but at least you've got a sense of where the debate is and where it's going to go from here, I think. And I think that's hopefully useful for you.